Hello, my name is Erik Gartzke. I'm a professor at the University of California, San Diego, and today I will be talking about asymmetric arms races. Well, thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here. I want to make sure to turn off on my phone before we get going. It's probably a good idea for any scholar to have some device that tells them to shut up eventually. So, yeah, there you go. When I was invited to come speak here, of course, I was thrilled. But one of the even more exciting parts was I got to pick my date. And today is Armistice Day. This is the day that World War I formally ended. And as a veteran, I went to a very unsuccessful football game over the weekend. Notre Dame won by a ridiculously large margin against my alma mater's football team. But you know, the Notre Dame community celebrated our veterans, and I was very honored and appreciated that a great deal. So. Broadly speaking, the people in this room are part of a community who are trying to do two things that I think are very important. And you can differ on which emphasis to place on these, but they're both there together. And one of those is to make war less likely to happen, to make the world a more peaceful place. Okay. And the other is to make sure that our society does better in that international competition when and if it comes to pass, right? So knowledge is power, and the kind of knowledge that we deal in, we trade in, is the knowledge that can make the world more peaceful or more successful from the perspective of our community. And I think each of those is valuable. So I congratulate you on being engaged and interested in this community. And I'm going to share with you a little piece of what I've been doing in this area. I always tell my audiences, if you don't like what I present, tell me and I'll present something else. Because what I do like to do, and what one of the privileges of being a scholar is, you can follow your curiosity, and I've got a lot of curiosity. So my co-author, Andres Gannon, found, he made this graphic, and it took him lots of time to build this graphic. He put some keywords into ChatGPT, and it spit something out like this. What I'm discovering at U.S. Cybercom is one of the most powerful tools for making the engine of recursive irrelevance happen is AI. So what we're doing with a great deal of vigor is spewing out PowerPoint presentations at a faster and faster rate of speed every month. So it is saving human effort, and if not always the way that we would like. Okay. So I'm going to talk with you, if I can, yeah? I'm going to talk with you. It just wiggled. Yeah. They said it was here. No? I'm not getting the slides to. Huh? There we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk with you today about arms racing. And this project was what I'm probably a little bit known for is taking classic subjects that people think they understand already and that there's no point in really paying much attention to because we figured it out, and throwing a bit of a monkey wrench in there and making an argument that possibly there's a different way of thinking about it. And I won't claim to be particularly successful at that, but I do enjoy very much that kind of framing or rubric to do scholarship. There are other people that come up with new topics that nobody studied before, and that's terrific. But for me, I like classic questions, at least in settings in which I think I can make a little bit different stab, a little bit different argument. So what we're asking is, what is an arms race, and how does arms racing work? And this cartoon is supposed to tell you that an arms race is a race, and it involves two entities, usually countries, doing something very similar and then ending in their utter destruction. Okay, and what we got this from a scholarly tradition, including people like Richardson, who was a meteorologist at the turn of the last century, and he was so horrified. This is what happens in our community sometimes. Somebody notices that war happens and they quit what they were doing in some completely different field and they become an expert on our field. So Richardson stopped forecasting the weather and he started forecasting wars. And the way he understood war was it's a iterated, reciprocal buildup of military capabilities that ends in ... nobody's explained how, war. Right? When I teach my undergraduate students, I use another example or metaphor, and that's from the TV series South Park. It's called the Underpants Gnomes. And in this story, I hope I'm not, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen this yet, maybe cover your ears. But it's been a few years since this episode came out, so I think I can get away with this. So the kids are getting in trouble from their parents because they're losing clothing. Anybody who's had children knows this is a thing. You're never quite sure how, but their clothes go missing. And you think this shouldn't be the case, but it is. Okay, so the kids are trying to defend themselves against this attack from their parents. And their explanation is, well, there's these little creatures that sneak in at night and steal our clothes. And the parents are skeptical. Who could have known? All right, so the kids decide to prove it by chasing down the Underpants Gnomes. And they go to this big warehouse where the Underpants Gnomes are collecting all these children's undergarments and baling them up. And they confront the gnomes and say, what are you doing? What is this for? And they get a business model, which is step 1, collect underpants. Step 3, war. Okay, or what I should have said is profits. Right? But in international relations, the theory goes step 1's underpants, and step 3, war. Or step 1, arms race, and step 3, war. And we're never sure why it is that having more weapons means war. It could be, there could be a story there, but it's not really spelled out very carefully. So that leaves me suspicious, and we end up making a different explanation. Okay, so a different story isn't that they're competing together in the same way for the same purpose, but in fact they're doing this in a completely different way. That arms races are not a iterated reciprocal buildup of military capabilities, but they're an iterated reciprocal offset of military capabilities. When somebody else builds more rocks, you don't build more rocks, you build more paper. If they build more paper, you don't build more paper, you build scissors, and so on. And so what I'm going to try to argue today is that we should expect that arms races are asymmetric in their force structure, that countries are going to play rock, paper, scissors. They're not going to play rock, rock, or apples, apples. And because of that, it can be difficult to find an arms race if you're looking in the wrong direction, if you're looking for the wrong indicators of an arms race. Classic academic thing to do, we come up with a theory, a notion about how humans behave, and then we go look, and if they don't behave that way, we say they're doing it wrong, we're gonna go check again, right? Or we're gonna check more carefully, we're gonna measure it better, because darn it, they must be doing what we think they're doing. But at some point, perhaps, if you're having trouble finding a relationship that's out there, it's because it's not there. And that's a useful time to go back and ask yourself some questions about whether your intuition was probably pointed in the right general direction, but maybe there's some details that you got wrong. Okay, so, so the conventional wisdom tells us that arms racing, that the details of arms racing isn't very important. And in fact, in general, this isn't always the case. In fact, a number of your faculty here do a very distinguished job of pushing against this tendency, but perhaps they wouldn't completely disagree with me that a lot of international relations theory isn't that thick on content. Okay, so we talk about the balance of power, but we don't talk about the guns and bombs and bullets or economic influence or whatever it is in much detail on occasion. And potentially the content is important. It might potentially matter. What kinds of weapons you buy. And when we watch governments buying weapons, we think we see that they think that's true. Okay, so the U.S. Congress, when it passes the budget, which sometimes happens and we know sometimes doesn't, but let's say it happens, okay, that when Congress passes a defense budget, they spend an enormous amount of time arguing about what they will spend the money on. There are even times where Congress says, you, military, will buy stuff that you don't want to have. And the military complains, we don't want those things. And the Congress says, no, 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 you need to have them. So the politicians, the operators, the people who are generating the history or the data that we're looking at clearly seem to care about the details, the content of these things. And we're going to try to treat that with a little bit of respect, maybe not as much as we should, but pointing in the direction of caring about what it is they're buying as opposed to just how much they're spending. So that's one step of this. So states intentionally, so one way in which we could care about the content is if we're looking at, there's a tradition that does look at qualitative arms races, but by and large, the notion here is that these are symmetrical. If the enemy buys a tank, we want a tank. If the enemy buys a battleship, we want a battleship. And this is another but similar way of looking at arms racing that we're going to argue against. So one of the classic examples of an arms race is the Anglo-German naval arms race of about a century ago. And it was literally like this. One side laid down a keel for a dreadnought, and the other side laid down a keel for a dreadnought. One side laid down a keel for a battleship, and the other side laid down a keel for a battleship, and so on. All right, so that's another way that the literature or the tradition has looked at this. So one possibility is we don't pay attention to content at all, but we're gonna pay attention to how much you spend. And the arms race is how much money is being spent by each side. The second way that we can look at this, or have looked at it, is to pay some attention to what's being bought, but to assume in effect that there's a kind of comparison or a lining up of these capabilities. And you can even imagine like a graphic maybe online or on a book of the force structures of different countries, and they will line up, here's how many aircraft carriers this country has, and here's how many aircraft carriers this country has, and so on. And our argument is going to be that all those things are happening, but they're not happening enough. They're not prominent or common enough that they're showing up in our data. We're not finding these patterns. They're happening occasionally, but not consistently. And that one explanation for this is that you, in military terms, don't necessarily need to buy an aircraft carrier when the other side buys an aircraft carrier, or a battleship when the other side buys a battleship. That in military terms, it makes as much or more sense when the other side buys a battleship to buy something that's really good at sinking battleships, like a submarine. Okay. So, we skipped. Okay, we skipped off a whole bunch. How did that happen? Oh, I see. Sorry. Operator error. Okay. So, there's a graphic problem here. So the way that the literature has tried to see if there's arms races going on is they look at how much one country spends and they divide it by how much the two countries together spends, and they see if that changes over time, right? And we don't find a systematic pattern of behavior. So our story is about this offset. And that means that you can't look at the data on spending, you have to look at the data on what they're spending it on. Okay. So force structure decisions. I'm not sure I understand my own writing here. Okay, so basically what we're going to try to do is look for evidence of more buying of less like things. Okay, real world example, because these things usually help. World War II ends. Right? Hitler's been defeated, Tojo is gone, everybody's at peace, the world's a wonderful place, at least for a few minutes. And then Cold War happens, okay? And the US and Soviet Union are at each other's throats. Erstwhile friends are now adversaries. And the US decides it needs to rearm, especially in the aftermath of the Korean War. The Soviets never really disarmed, so they have a great big World War II wartime army, and they continue to maintain that. And the US decides it has to do something about that. So one possibility is they can remobilize the World War II army or something like it. Put 10 million Americans in uniform again. But taxpayers aren't loving that idea. Young men aren't loving that idea because the draft. Okay, so it's a very unpopular option and an expensive one. And ultimately, what the United States decides to do is to fight fire with not fire, with something else. Instead of building a great big conventional army like the Soviets have, they're going to build a little conventional army. Well, not that little, it's still pretty big, but it's a way smaller than the Soviet army. And they're going to put a few of those soldiers in Europe, enough of them that if they all get slaughtered and murdered, people in the United States will notice and not be happy. Okay? But few enough soldiers that there is just no way that army is going to defeat the Soviet army if it invades. Okay? Tom Schelling, a number of years ago, likens this to a tripwire. The purpose of the US forces in Europe isn't to defeat the Soviet Union, it's to die on European soil to give the United States the impetus to do something else. And that something else is not necessarily to build a giant conventional army to defend Europe. It's to nuke the Soviet Union. Okay? So instead of responding to a big conventional threat with a big conventional counter threat, the US creates a big non-conventional counter threat. Why? Because it's a lot cheaper, because it's easier, and because the US has a lot of fair number of nuclear weapons already. It's what, in our terms, what we call its comparative military advantage. It can take the same amount of tax dollars and the same amount of industrial resources and produce a much more potent nuclear force than it can if it uses those resources to build the conventional force it would need. Okay? There's an offset, an unlike response to a given threat. Okay, so this is our theory of qualitative arms racing. Okay, and we're going to start back, and this is very, very, very. We're stripping out of our story a lot of context and detail. Why? Because it's too hard. Okay, start simple, and as we go along in the future, we can layer up more complexity. But one of the advantages of simplicity is even people like me can understand it. Okay, so imagine a world in which, when fights happen, there's zero sum. Okay, one side can win, but both sides can't win. Okay, there might be settings in wars where it's not exactly that way, but I think a fair description in general of the process of military conflict is that it's really hard for both sides to be the winner. Okay, to some degree, at most there's one winner. Okay, so what it turns out in those kinds of situations, we've studied these a lot, mathematicians and political scientists have studied these kinds of contests a lot, and zero-sum contests have the quality that you can only do better in that contest by having the other side do worse. Okay, and you can't both do well. So the best you can do in a situation in which the other side is more likely to win isn't to double down on being somewhat less likely to win, but try to find a different way to compete on a different dimension in which you have better prospects for success. Okay? If the other side brings a bigger knife to the knife fight, make this a gunfight, not a knife fight, because you don't want to be the second best armed person in a fight. All right, so that's our theory of kind of underlying this logic of a qualitative arms race. Now, how does the arms race play? If two countries are engaging in a purely symmetrical arms race, let's go back to the Anglo-German arms race at the turn of the last century. The British are building a new class of warships called dreadnoughts. And the Germans quickly catch on to this and they build their own versions of dreadnoughts. And then the British up the game by building battleships, which are kind of, well, first they build something called a super dreadnought and then they build battleships. But basically what we're talking about is bigger and bigger ships with bigger and bigger things that go pew, pew, all right? So, and both sides build a lot of these. But at some point, the Germans figure out that no matter how hard they try, they're going to be the second best country in the world at building battleships. They're going to be the second best fleet at sea. And they realize that being second best in war is not a good thing to be. And the Germans essentially cede, before the war even begins, they cede the naval competition to the British. They don't completely do this. They do sally forth their fleet a couple of times during World War I. But in essence, they stop building these big, expensive hunks of steel that float in the ocean because they're very resource intensive, and they move those resources over to doing other things that Germany does comparatively better. And those include, of course, a big land army with lots of artillery and things like that, but also things that are really good at sinking battleships. They invest late in this process, but before the war actually begins, in things like submarines and motor torpedo boats, which are the right way to pursue sinking enemy battleships if you can't build more battleships. Right? This is an asymmetric response. They started with a symmetric response. They discovered this zero-sumness in the arms race, that they were going to go to war with the second best fleet, and that wasn't a good thing. So they shifted to doing things that were unlike what the British were doing, to focus on things that were good at destroying the things that the British were good at building. Okay. So this is a part where we get to statistics, right? And the old saw about, one of the small textbooks that I give to my students sometimes is a cute little book called How to Lie with Statistics. Because everyone knows you can lie with statistics, but they really appreciate it when you show them how to lie with statistics so they can be good at lying. All right, so we're going to use data and statistics to look at these relationships. And there are a variety of different ways we can look at these relationships, but I'm going to pitch really quickly that this is a useful way to do this. And the way I'm going to do it is with death. Okay? Many people die. It happens on occasion. Okay? Very few of the people in this room have actually died, so this will be helpful. But a number of years ago, Congress was really concerned about Americans dying, and so they brought in a bunch of people who were expert on this. They were the CEOs of the largest tobacco corporations in the United States. And Congress interviewed these people in a committee session. And one after one, they asked them, do you believe your products are harmful for human health? And each one of the CEOs said, no, I do not believe that my products are harmful for human health. And the public watching this and the Congress members watching this, they knew that these people were lying, right? That they were lying in order to make money off of the ill health of the American people. But I ask you, after this talk, to go to your local morgue or a medical statistics center and find me a case of somebody who's died from smoking. It doesn't exist. No human being has ever received a medical diagnosis of dying from smoking. And so in a strange way, these 7 greedy, evil-minded tobacco CEOs were telling the truth. There is no such thing as a human who's died from smoking. Right? There are millions and millions of human beings who've died from the diseases that are associated with smoking. And when you smoke, the statistical probability that you'll get one of these diseases goes way up, right? Many of us understand, we believe, we've been told that tobacco smoking is bad for your health. All of that knowledge is based upon statistics and probability and tendency. There's no actual cases of somebody who's died from smoking. Okay, so that doesn't mean that case-based research is wrong or bad. It means that certain kinds of evidence, certain kinds of questions are harder to tack down with a case, because in some extreme cases, there won't be any incidents. There's no cases of smoking. There are lots and lots and lots of cases of people whose risk of dying early went up because they smoked. So there's a tendency there, all right? We believe that the effect of these processes that we're studying are tendencies. There may be a few cases where we can point to something and think we've demonstrated it, but by and large, mostly it'll be a tendency, a shift in probability rather than an emphatic sort of change in the determination of an outcome. All right, so we're going to measure how countries allocate their military power by a data set that Anders developed with extraordinary effort and resources. He coded every capability that every country has for the last 40 years. Right? How many guns, how many 105 millimeter artillery guns, how many main battle tanks, how many tactical aircraft, so on and so on and so on. So we have the portfolio of military capabilities for almost all of the countries in the world for the past 40 years. And what we already knew before we started this is there's tremendous variation, up to 50% across countries, in the distribution of these capabilities. Countries are not buying the same things with their budgets, even controlling for the size of those budgets. Two countries with equivalent spending will oftentimes spend it on very different kinds of military capabilities. So the question is why? And in Andres's PhD dissertation, he looked at alliances as a factor and was able to show that allies that trust each other are much more likely to build military forces that are complementary, that have different capabilities that complement each other. Okay? So here we're going to look at, are countries that don't trust each other more likely to build unlike capabilities? This is a distribution of the capabilities, portfolio similarity. So if you have two countries that have the same mix of military capabilities, they bought 20% of their budget was spent on tactical aircraft, 30% was spent on tanks, and so on, then they would have a value of 1. If they were not alike at all, they had completely different distributions of capabilities, then this would get a similarity score of 0. Okay, so we put up graphs like this to make people visit their optometrist. That we get subsidized by optometrists. And no, nobody can ever read these things. They're simply there to tell you that we ran some statistics and a regression, and if you're interested, you can look in the paper. But what you want to see is this. And what this is a plot of the marginal effects. We're trying to predict which countries, which pairs of countries have similar portfolios and which countries have dissimilar portfolios. Who's buying the same stuff and who's buying different stuff? And it turns out if two countries have a history of not getting along with each other, they buy significantly different stuff. Okay? So Israel and Egypt buy much different military capabilities than two countries that are getting along okay with each other, I guess. Mexico and Brazil, something like that. I don't know for a fact that those two cases are that way, but I'm just giving you an illustration. All right, so Then we took this one step further and we said, well, if this is true, it should be more true for the countries that really don't like each other. And so we separated out rivals between those that are kind of casual rivals that occasionally, do something nasty to each other, and the ones that are really at each other's throats in a more extreme way. And the more intensive the rivalry, the more they've been fighting in the past, the more likely they are to have dissimilar portfolios, right? So if two countries have a very high likelihood of fighting each other again, because they've been fighting each other in the past, it is much more likely that they will buy weapons that are not similar to what their adversary is buying, okay? Now, I remind you that this is counterintuitive because a lot of the literature implied that these are exactly the kind of countries that should copy each other because they are nervous about each other. Hey, somebody over there just bought a new kind of missile. I better buy that one too so that I'm able to fight them more effectively. Well, the data says that they're not doing that. When somebody buys a new kind of missile, they're buying something different. Now, we aren't showing this at this point, but my intuition about this is they're buying things that are really good at disabling that missile, right? In the current war in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have some tanks, and they could have bought more, but instead they decided to get a whole bunch of things that are good at destroying tanks. They could have bought anti-aircraft batteries, and they have some, but instead of buying more anti-aircraft batteries, they're buying all kinds of things that are really good at destroying anti-aircraft batteries, like HARM missiles or drones or things like that, okay? So the idea here is that you're trying to go after your adversary's capabilities, not by replicating them, but by offsetting them, by creating capabilities that are good at that rock, paper, scissors logic, which exists in combat arms, right? People will point out that combat arms means that you have different kinds of weapons in your portfolio, but the logic of that, the reason you have those different weapons is not so that you can go after a tank with a tank and go after an airplane with an airplane, but so that you can go after a tank with an airplane and go after an airplane with an anti-aircraft missile, and so on and so on. Right. The trick is to defeat your adversary with an unlike capability so that you have an unfair advantage. All right, so what did we find? Rivals don't mimic as much as everybody else does. There's some mimicry out there generally, and we could go into the reasons why in every setting there's going to be some similarity in terms of force structures, but rivals have less similar force structures than everybody else. And they're the ones engaging in arms racing, we think. Okay. Arms racing is about identifying advantages in unlike domains, figuring out where you can get something that your enemy doesn't have that can defeat the things that they do have, not copying them. Okay? So the implication here is that researchers and practitioners should look at what states buy rather than how much they spend for signs of arms racing. And that arms control can also focus on these kinds of issues. Now, one of the opportunities, but also limitations here, is that the more that countries focus on relatively simple force structures, or even force structures that parallel each other, the easier it is for arms control to work. The SALT and START negotiations probably were made easier because they were talking about apples to apples comparisons across these two countries. And the Washington Naval Treaty put limits on the number of naval platforms by symmetric categories. They didn't say, hey, United States, you can only have so many battleships as long as Japan has so many tanks, because those comparisons are difficult to do. So to the degree that countries are competing with each other with unlike capabilities, you have an inherently more difficult arms control environment. Well, that's what I have for you. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
I'll call out the questions. Does anybody have a seating chart? It's being circulated. That'd be great. And we'd like to start, if possible, with some undergrad questions to get things going. Yeah.
Please wait for the microphone.
Thank you so much for your talk. I think I'm just trying to better understand the argument. When you talk about like offsetting capabilities, do you find that these rivals have an imbalance in the category of like defense or offensive capabilities they have, or is it more that they're offsetting an offensive capability with another offensive capability? I guess.
The question was, are they, basically it's a scope question about, are we talking about offense versus defense, or are we talking sort of within those categories? Are they buying different kinds of defensive weapons and so on? We think the latter. We're not at a point yet where we can demonstrate that, but the logic of the story we're telling is very much so. In the U.S. case, the first offset was this nuclear retaliation, right? Don't invade Europe or we'll end the world. Okay. Now you can imagine that those kinds of threats have there's some limit to their credibility. How much of Europe can I invade before you end the world? How about if I take this little piece here, right? And so one of the problems on both sides was this was risky for the Soviets, and it was not super credible in some cases for the US and NATO. And so both sides tried to innovate away from this. But interestingly, when they innovated, they went to different responses. The Soviets doubled down on armored capabilities and artillery, and in particular, they developed a whole doctrine of chemical weapons. When I was a kid, I thought maybe if there was a war in Europe that the Soviets would use nuclear weapons. I didn't realize it was going to be the Americans. But actually, the Soviets didn't want a nuclear war. They wanted a chemical weapons war. They were nicer, okay, right? No, not at all, okay. But the Soviets are the first country in the world to develop the equipment to carry out an aggressive chemical weapons war in a modern world. The BMP had technology inside that would create a positive pressure so that the chemical wouldn't get into the vehicle. If there was a leak in the vehicle, it would push things out, not pull things in. And the idea they had was they would move across Western Europe very, very quickly and hand the US a fait accompli. Okay? Like, don't nuke us, it's too late, it's not going to do any good, we already got Europe. Okay? So the US response was the second offset. They said, well, we got to slow down the Soviets. And they didn't say, well, let's develop our own version of chemical weapons and our own, well, they did some of that. But mostly what they did was develop anti-tank guided munitions, precision guided weapons. And these were going to plink tanks and slow down the Soviet armored assault to give the US time to react to the situation and to mobilize public opinion, potentially to make the threat of nuclear attack more credible. Okay, so again, it's an apples to oranges response in these situations. It's not that apples to apples is not going to happen. It's that when you respond to somebody else's capabilities with the same capabilities, it makes it relatively easier for you to figure out that somebody must be doing it wrong, right? If you're building 10 tanks and they're building 100 tanks, maybe you shouldn't be building tanks. Like, you should be building something that will give you a little bit better shot if it's available. So the US is building a lot fewer tanks than the Soviets, and instead of building more tanks, it decides to build things that are good at destroying tanks. Right? It could have put those resources into more tanks, but it decides, that's not the best bang for the buck, literally. So, does that kind of help? All right.
What you get another undergrad.
And there's one back there, too.
I wanted to ask if you think there's a limit to this offense versus offense arms race. Like, is there a point where, I guess kind of like nukes, where the weapons get so powerful where there isn't another viable option, and so it becomes symmetric?
Yeah. So the question is, can you play this out to some kind of bound that makes it absurd? Governments and military are very good at getting too absurd. So, but what we've seen historically is that seems pretty far, right? Like even in ancient times, societies could spend an enormous amount of their discretionary wealth on military power. The question was, what would they buy with those resources, right? And almost because it was absurdly expensive, they're interested in making it more efficient, at least in military terms, right? Every time the Romans built a ballista, that was some Roman centurions that weren't going to be there because that's some resources they couldn't use to hire some guys in sandals to march around Europe. So military affairs has these opportunity costs. Militaries make careful, concerted attempts to make assessments about what the right mix of different bits and pieces of military kit is, and they come up with detailed studies of these. This is called TO&E, Table of Organization and Equipment. All right, so they're already in this process, but the politicians are also going to get involved because they have a stake in this. Okay, if the military buys a bunch of weapons that it thinks is a good spend of the government's money, but the politicians aren't convinced of this, then they usually have some kind of animated discussion. So one thing that was the case recently, the A-10 Warthog is like a perennial favorite among people who don't work in the military. But the Air Force wanted to get rid of this thing for decades. And they finally did. Actually, a colleague at work just came in with a big sack of 30 millimeter casings from the shells and said this was the last fire of a Maryland National Guard A-10. They decommissioned all those platforms. Okay, this isn't because Congress or the Pentagon thinks they're spending too much money. It's because they think they're spending the money in a way that's different from what they want. And that presumably is an evaluation about what force structure will have the biggest impact in terms of the kinds of competition, the kinds of competitors that the society anticipates. So,
Erik, thanks. The idea that people can compete by doing something different than the person they're competing with strikes me as eminently plausible. Thinking about it in the context of arms races makes good sense to me. I did want to ask you, though, two questions about the logic of your argument and then the empirics. So the logic that you use for asymmetrical responses, you say is based on Ricardo's notion of comparative advantage. Right. And I think for two domains, that's probably right. Domestically, you may be constrained, to a certain extent, and you would respond, in a way that played to your comparative advantage. And certainly within alliances, the sort of division of labor makes sense. But I'm not sure that this makes sense to me in terms of how you deal with a rival. I think that you say a couple of times, and I agree completely, you're thinking about the relationship with the rival in zero-sum terms. Well, comparative advantage, a la Ricardo, is not primarily a zero-sum way of thinking about specialization. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the logic. The empirics I'm wondering about. What you're explaining is dyad years. And so what that really tells us is the difference between you and me is the value of the portfolio similarity at any given time, right? So, but it seems, and maybe I'm just pushing you to talk about what I want you to talk about, is you're saying that this is a decision that states make, and that it can be advantageous. You rock, paper, scissors. But I'm not sure, given that you're looking at the difference between the two of us over time, that you can say anything more than we often are different in terms of our strategic portfolio, but why we're different, and whether that's a good or a bad thing. So, you don't, and I'm not sure if the data set you use has any measure for prevailing in the rivalry, but it'd be interesting to know, which side prevails. And that would require not, showing that there's some distance between our portfolios, but also then making a decision about who is playing asymmetrically and who's playing, by the good old, emulation of the traditional military formats. So help me with the logic and help me with the empirics.
Thank you so much. I like both of those questions. In the paper, we were struggling with an example of this in international affairs, and so we came up with Tanya Harding, because the Olympics is an international event, and I don't know if any of you saw the movie, which is better than reality in many ways, but that Tanya Harding's problem was that she was competing symmetrically, right? She was a U.S. Olympic athlete, and Nancy Kerrigan was a U.S. Olympic athlete, and they were going toe-to-toe, almost literally, for the U.S. championship. And then, the champion and some other people would be on the U.S. Olympic team. And Tanya's problem was that she had made the assessment that she was being the best skater she could, but that Nancy Kerrigan had already gone asymmetric, and what Kerrigan was bringing to the sport was an aesthetic element that Harding didn't have. She skated more beautifully. People, and one of the things about figure skating is it's not. People have arguments about what is a sport and what isn't a sport. I'm not making that argument. I'm simply saying that there's an important element of it that is aesthetic, right? That the score is not simply a function of how high did you jump or how many times did you spin around, but there's an artistic element to it. And Harding had Kerrigan had cornered that piece of the sport in the U.S. And Harding wasn't able. She'd already made like the biggest jumps of any woman U.S. Olympic skater in history, and she wasn't going to be able to do like another spin. So she decides that she has to respond to this either by accepting that in this arms race of competition, asymmetric competition over artistry and athleticism, that she's going to end up second best, or she has to compete in a different way. And that's when the police get involved, because she resorts to violence, or she doesn't, but her accomplices resort to violence. Okay, so we liken this to what an arms race does, and what sometimes an arms race amounts to, which is that if two countries are competing with each other and they can get to a point of consensus about who's going to win a war if it needs to happen, then the arms race has served its purpose, and they can both sort of end the competition there. But somebody at that point is going to have to accept that they're the loser. And they may not like that. So they might respond by being, and this is what the Germans did in the first decades of the 20th century, is they stopped competing with the other side on a similar dimension, and they started competing in a different dimension. They stopped building battleships and they started building things that sink battleships. Okay, but ultimately, then both sides continued to disagree about how the arms race would play out if it continued, and it became a hot war. Right? Kerrigan gets attacked with violence. Okay, so that's what we expect to see. We can't actually show that in the data yet. What we can show is this behavior that's consistent with that story and inconsistent with the stories that people have told about arms races in the past. Right? I don't think we haven't been able to find a compelling reason why other theories of arms racing would predict that you'd be more likely to see countries buying unlike capabilities in a rivalry for some other reason. What we hope to do moving forward is to tighten that connection. And there are a couple of ways we can do that. The first, and most straightforward, and I think in many ways most effective, will be to do a couple of case studies to show countries making these decisions. One thing that can be very useful is we can go back to the historical record, and if we can find cases, and they're out there, we just have to go through and find these cases where there's documentary evidence of what officials in the government were doing and why they were doing it, and why it was, for example, in 1912 that the Germans decided to stop building battleships, right? Why it was at some other period that somebody decides to build unlike capabilities to the adversaries. They're building apples, we're going to build oranges, and here's why, right? To fill in that. Ultimately, what we want to do is take this to the process of war causation itself and see if we can explain when wars happen as a product of arms races and when, in fact, the arms races preempt the need for a war because they do a good job of convincing both sides what the war will look like. Yeah.
Could I just follow up really quickly? Because I love the Tonya Harding, Nancy Kerrigan illustration.
If you can put it into a paper, you should always do that.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I have to caveat this by saying that what I know about
Figure skating.
Competitive figure skating, fit on the back of a matchbook. But for me, a couple of things about it. I see Nancy, or I saw Nancy Kerrigan as sort of the gold standard of figure skating, meaning a combination of athleticism and aesthetic talent. That's the standard that most people emulate. Now, you're absolutely right that for a variety of reasons, Tonya Harding couldn't play in that game. And so the asymmetric response had some logic. On the other hand, the end result was that not only did Tonya Harding have her medal taken back, but she also went to jail. And so, that then
she didn't actually go to jail, but she was fine. Yes.
Yeah, but I mean,
she got caught.
Yeah, it wasn't ultimately effective. The powerful the powerful case would be a case where something truly asymmetric and innovative, has the war-winning or the rivalry prevailing result. What I don't know from the data set you're using is there's a lot of asymmetrics. Is it asymmetric because you're Tonya Harding and the only way you can win is to cheat and it's not even going to help you win? Or is it really being driven by an advantage to the asymmetric approach, a la Sunza or Liddell-Hart.
So in the Harding case, just a little background because we did check. So Harding won the U.S. figure skating championship 2 years previous. I think it was 2 years previously, but recently before this. Kerrigan's response was to up the aesthetic beauty of her skating because she had gotten to the point where Harding could land a better jump than Kerrigan. And Harding had kind of pulled out ahead of Kerrigan by improving the athleticism of her performance by landing these harder jumps that Kerrigan could not land. And so Kerrigan sort of upped the game by improving the aesthetics of her performance, which Harding couldn't do. So it was very much asymmetric capabilities. Now, it's an open question what would have happened if Harding and Kerrigan had just stuck to their guns, but it seems clear from the law case and so on that Harding had decided that she was not going to win, given that she had optimized, she'd become the best lander of jumps that she could, and Kerrigan had become better at the aesthetics part of the sport. And so Harding's assessment was that she would lose to Kerrigan, and that there wasn't anything, she couldn't land another half turn or something like that. And she wasn't going to become more elegant and beautiful on the ice. And so she was looking at, essentially at that point, the peaceful arms race of figure skating was predictably that Kerrigan was going to win. At least that was Harding's assessment. And that's why this second asymmetric step. I agree completely. The nice thing that doesn't always happen is there's enough space in the paper that we can write a nice tight case study or two. And I think it'll be a great deal of fun, and it will be a way to move the paper forward. We're also, I want to be very clear, this is just us exploring an idea and providing some plausibility for it. The process continues. That this is episode 1 of the Star Wars saga, not the last episode. So, yeah.
Doris in the back.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was very insightful. And I just had a quick clarifying question on if your theory is more of like a worldwide arms race versus a like 1 or 2 state, and then if so, is everyone aware of that, or how does that work?
That's a terrific question, and I don't know the answer, but it causes me to start thinking about things. The way we're conceiving of it right now is narrowly bilateral. Okay, I can imagine a situation very clearly in which it would be more than 2 actors, but the thing that a bilateral, or what we say is dyadic in the sort of speak of the research community. But what that does is it's kind of a building block for those relationships involving more than 2 actors, right? You have to have at least 2 actors to have, it's like it takes 2 to tango or 2 to fight, right? If you see one person fighting themselves, they're either exercising or, they've got some emotional issues to work through. A fight usually involves at least 2 people. It could involve more than 2 people, right? So we're dealing at the minimal level that we think is necessary to have the phenomenon happen. And then actually what's really exciting and interesting is to think about how it combines up from there, right? And I should also say there are a couple of things that we already know that I didn't talk about in my talk because like I said, I wanted to scrape off all the other relevant factors and deal with it very simply. 2 things that I think clearly matter. One is geography, okay? Geography is a pain in the parts for people throughout history, right? That land bridge from Asia, yeah, well, it probably people had cold feet or wet feet or something. It was hard to get there. Right? It would have been nicer if they had like jets or whatever, or if it was closer, if the land bridge wasn't just a little tiny thing, but like whole continent. Okay, so if you're China and you want to invade Taiwan, you're going to have to do it with ships. Okay, doesn't matter how much time your PLA guys spend in the pool, they're just not going to get good enough that you don't need ships. Okay, well, what if China is second best at building a navy? Right now, it looks like it kind of is second best. It's pretty good, but it's not as good as the U.S. Navy, at least not yet. Okay, so do you throw up your hands and say, well, let's take this resource and invest it in something that we can do comparatively better, like maybe tanks or missiles or something like that? Well, no, because the tanks don't swim. You have to get across that water. Geography has created an obstacle in your way that you have to surmount in order to achieve your objective. And the fact that it's not ideal in terms of your comparative advantage, you can't build as good a Navy with the same resources as the US can. And I'm not saying they can't, I'm saying this is notional, right? Well, too bad, right? Nazi Germany couldn't build an invasion fleet that was as effective as the British ability to resist that invasion fleet. But they had to try because the channel wasn't going to dry up. And the British were being obstinate and refusing to accept a negotiated settlement of their disagreement. So geography is a factor. If there's something in the way that forces you to build capabilities that aren't what you're best at, then you either have to give up on your quest or you have to accept that you're taking a risk. Okay. The other thing is politics. Maybe the things that your society wants and cares about, your leaders prize, require you to have capabilities that aren't really the capabilities that your generals would like to win the war. And this is where we go back to that story about the A-10. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that in the A-10 case, but basically the idea is that politicians, one of the reasons, even though, one of the wisdoms that our research, our broader community has told politics for a long time is let generals do the generaling, right? Politicians shouldn't get involved in military decisions, but they keep getting involved in military decisions. Now, one explanation is they're pathological and stupid and they shouldn't do this, but another explanation is they care about the outcomes, and they care not just about winning the battle, but what kind of victory you get, what you get from that victory. So the fact that the Wehrmacht could go to Hitler and say, listen, we've done awesome, we're really good at land warfare, let's stick to that. Well, Hitler had other objectives in mind. He wanted to put the British in their place and get them to the bargaining table. And so the German military was pushed to do something that arguably wasn't their forte. All right, so those things are happening in this data, and we're not accounting for them. We're not looking at that per se. We have a bunch of controls for different things, but an extension of this will be to look at how comparative advantage, the military comparative advantage logic, interacts with geography and political objectives of states.
Okay, next we have David, Liza, Iris, and Sam, and Ian.
I'll keep my responses quick or shorter.
Hey, thank you. I had a quick question about your comment about asymmetric growth. So we looked at the Chinese, they're kind of using that tactic. You look at the United States, we're building a lot more carriers or fighter, 5th gen aircraft, and they seem to be building a lot more beyond line of sight ordnance or missiles or even surface air threats. So I guess the question would be, at what point do we advocate for, let's say, restructuring of our armed forces versus the risk of our personnel and service members? The United States Marine Corps, for one, took away tanks and armor, the organization I'm part of, but yet we haven't really seen the effects, positive or negative, of that yet because we haven't gotten to conflict. I find it very challenging to talk to Congress or any of the mothers of their service members to say, because we think the Chinese are developing these specific munitions or weapons, we're advocating for something different. So I'm curious to see how your thoughts are on how do we communicate that with, let's say, the taxpayers or civilians, because I think that's very challenging to bring up if we're talking about asymmetric warfare.
Yeah, so one of the things that force structure does is it's a bet on the future about what kinds of capabilities will be valuable to you, right? And the Marine Corps getting rid of heavy armor makes it much more mobile. But it pays a price in terms of the mass that it can bring to the battlefield, right? So those are trade-offs that militaries face all the time. One of the problems in warfare is that it tends to work to your weaknesses. The example that I've used before is the U.S. was carrying out dogfights over Vietnam with the F-4 Phantom, which is a big interceptor aircraft, two-pilot aircraft, not necessarily the best dogfighting aircraft. And the kill ratios weren't particularly favorable. There are a couple of reasons for that, including training and so on. But one of the reasons was that the U.S. Navy's main threat in the 1950s and 60s was the Soviet Union. And they needed to have a capability that would confront Soviet forces. And the big threat from the Soviet forces for the Navy was big bombers like the Backfire with standoff missile capabilities. So the U.S. built a platform that was really good at countering the chief threat that they had, which it could fly very quickly, far away, and launch long-range missiles to attack that incoming bomber before, hopefully before it launched its standoff missiles. Okay, that's not the war we ended up fighting. And this is a recurring phenomenon. When I taught kind of mid-career soft soldiers at the Naval Postgraduate School, they asked this question: how come we keep fighting wars we're not prepared to fight? Well, because the war you prepared to fight, you deterred, right? If you get really good at something in a competitive environment, if you've spent your whole youth learning how to duel, right, with a rapier or something, or an épée or whatever it is, and then you get into an argument with somebody and they have a duel with you. If they choose swords, they're doing it wrong, right? They have a slightly better chance if they go for pistols, because that negates your technical advantage, right? So your adversary is always trying to capitalize on your comparative disadvantage, whatever that is. And that's part of what we're trying to capture in this story. When the Marine Corps changes what it's good at, it's also inviting future potential threats to try to optimize against what it's not good at, right? I wouldn't be completely surprised if in some future battlefield, Marine expeditionary troops are facing off against armor and not loving that, right? Because if I have to face the Marines, I want every advantage I can get because they're pretty good at what they do. So if they don't have tanks, maybe I should get some tanks.
I've got a 2-finger and 4 more questions, so good luck.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, how about we take a couple of questions, and then if we run short on time, I can respond to folks offline. So.
Yeah, this makes me think of the temporal element, right? So the story you're telling is very iterative, right? And it takes place over time. So can you talk a little bit more about, especially in the data, how you account for these asymmetries not necessarily being, number one, static, and number two, appearing immediately, right?
Yeah, I'll respond later. Yeah. The short answer is we didn't, but we're really interested in pursuing that. There are certain data limitations, but it's an inherently attractive thing to do. Yeah.
Thank you. 2 really brief questions. The first one, in understanding, pushing you kind of on the China point, a question that kept bubbling in my head is investing in maybe non-traditional weaponry, and is investing in cyber and AI a new way for countries that know strategically they're not going to win out the arms race. Is this something you could factor into this theory? So that first. And secondly, this is kind of a snowball on the earlier point, but it kept bubbling in my head about how alliance dynamics could fit into this. And a question that I had is, if you have a country that is maybe trying to asymmetrically balance and it has strong alliances that it knows could maybe account even for, I asymmetrically balance, I have the battleships, you have the sinkers, but I have an ally that can also build the sinkers. Does the arms race then become a game of not who can just balance out for the other person's weakness, but just who has the better strategic alliances, if it pans out that far?
Your instincts are really good. We'll follow up. Yeah.
Who's next?
Okay. Harrison.
Thank you. Interesting talk. I have just two brief questions. First is, how do you deal with the problem of reverse causality insofar as how much is rivalry or the fact that your arsenals differ drive that rivalry in the first place, versus it seems like the story you're saying is that you start as rivals and then you get apart. But how much is and you start specializing in specific arsenals, but how much of that question is already there at the start of your, I guess, your data range or what you're looking at. The second thing is how much, how do I put this? How much of this is only driven by one side? If I'm just building my military and competing, but the other side is like, okay, I need to lose, or I'm going to lose if I keep doing this, I'm going to become asymmetrical. How much of that gap is just by one, recognizing that, and then driving while you're just kind of still doing what you're doing, which also leads to kind of a side question of how much is the other side also responding to the asymmetries in the first place? Are they simply keep doing what they're doing, or do they then recognize the asymmetries and then specialize into a different region, or do they keep doing what they're doing? Does that make sense? And if you've been able to see that in the data.
Yeah, I think those are great questions, and they make a lot of sense to me. Like those are the right questions to ask. Going back to a previous point, one of the things we can do, although in a limited way, because we have this sort of tranche of time period, is that if we're right, we would expect that rivals will tend to diverge over time, right? The dynamic should be towards divergence. But that the kind of more traditional copying story would be that they tend to converge over time. And I think we can at least try to find if that's, if one dynamic or the other is the case. At the very least, even though there are sort of data limitations in that, to the degree that one or the other story is right, they're clearly pointing in different directions, and we should be able to see, even if we don't find a significant relationship, we could see one that's, kind of more one or more the other, and we might actually find that there is a significant relation, and it might well be that we're wrong, although we don't suspect that. So, yeah.
Sam?
Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to kind of understand a little bit more on what a state does after it realizes that a rival state has built capabilities to counter their current capabilities. Is it trying to develop new capabilities to counter those designed to undermine the current ones, or is it going to pivot to other capabilities so that the ones created in order to attack those are now kind of ineffective?
I'm not sure I'm following. I think I'm sort of half following, and my fear is that I would answer your question incorrectly. Do you want to ask it again for me, just after the talk? Would that make sense?
Sure. Okay.
Cool.
Thanks. So part of how you framed your talk was that thinking about arms racing qualitatively, as you do, might help us connect the dots between arms racing and actual outbreak of war, outbreak of hostilities. It sounds like that's something you're thinking about for the future. You maybe have some intuitions about how you're going to connect these things, but I'd like to hear what step 2 for the underwear gnomes is, if you can give us a preview.
Yeah. So the classical Richardson story that many people get in college, graduate school, and that we operate with in international relations is very rich in terms of like tit for tat escalation of capabilities, and then this empty space where something happens that we're not sure about, and then war. What I actually think is that the more thorough and effective the acting out of competition through arms purchases is, the less you have a need to fight that war, right? On one extreme, if somebody goes out and builds a capability that clearly stymies what you can do, so that you recognize, you know what, if I carry this the next step, I'm gonna lose, then maybe that's, you cut your losses at that point. You don't go to, it's seldom the case that it makes sense to go to war when you're sure it's going to be a bad outcome for you, okay? So at that point, maybe the very fact that, one thing that international relations scholars love to fetishize is what is called costly signals. Okay, I do something expensive to prove to you that I care about something. Right? This happens in ordinary life all the time. Somebody goes and buys an engagement ring. Okay? If you care about some partner a lot and you buy an engagement ring and you give it to them and say, "Listen, I got a great deal on this. It was really cheap." Okay. Well, in some sense, that's a good thing. That's wise purchasing, okay? But I'm not sure that many people want to say that. They have the intuition that, no, I shouldn't necessarily tell my loved one that I bought them something that was cheap, because part of the purpose of this symbol is I care about you a lot. I'm willing to do something very expensive to demonstrate how much I care about you. And if somebody else bought one that was cheap, you might say, I'm going with the one that's expensive, okay? I'm not saying that's the only criterion on which people make partner decisions, but it might be in the mix, okay? Same thing with arms racing. If you're willing to spend an enormous amount of money to prepare for a war with me, one thing I can draw from that is, you're serious about this, right? And if we go to war, you might be willing to spend an enormous amount of money to kill my people and defeat my army and eventually prevail. So maybe I'm better off cutting some kind of deal and avoiding that very unfortunate, expensive process, right? If we believe that one of the reasons, if not in my community, the main reason that countries fight each other is they don't know what's going to happen when they fight each other, then one way we can make war less common is to help them understand what's going to happen when they fight each other. And costly behaviors, like, for example, an arms race, is one way to do that. Right? Now, really quickly, there's such a thing as burning money. If anybody's seen a Monty Python movie, right, you can show somebody you really care about something by killing off your army, right, or sinking your battleships. But it turns out that it's better in other ways to keep that army around, to keep the battleships floating, and to show how much you care about something by having those battleships and even potentially sinking the other side's battleships.
So just a somewhat follow-up for Ian's question. You end with a very vague comment about it would be nice to study instability implications in the future. But you just hinted at something quite substantive, which is if you know what the outcome's going to be, if you know it's going to be a tough fight, then you're going to be more or less likely to do it. It seems to me like a qualitative arms race is much more likely to invite uncertainty and miscalculations of all sorts. And you could be, if you think the world is filled with conservative people who with doubt aren't going to act, I don't think that's the way it works a lot, because a lot of times it's optimistic miscalculation. So when you can't figure out the underlying technological balance because everybody's being asymmetric, I think that's a very dangerous world. And I think there's a lot for you to investigate there. I've never understood Huntington's point that quantitative arms races are more dangerous. It just doesn't seem right to me. 10,001 ballistic missiles compared to 11,000. At a certain point, you just lose any relevance. It's all stable at that point. But this qualitative stuff, I think, really invites all sorts of miscalculation. And with the technology moving ever faster, I think it's just going to get worse. And the question about AI and all that, we have no idea what we're talking about anymore. And so that's my kind of take on that. And I just want to invite you to either comment on that or to motivate into that direction of the research. 'Cause I think it's really fascinating and really important.
Thank you. I think we're in substantial agreement. A version of that story exists in the paper because the argument about if you're doing the same thing as the other side, that one of you is doing it wrong. Well, it should be relatively easier to figure out who's going to lose a quantitative arms race than a qualitative arms race. But because it's easier, you're building 10 tanks a month and they're building 100 tanks a month. You go, hey, I'm not building enough tanks. We got a problem, okay? But because it's relatively easy, one of the responses to that is to stop building tanks and start building something else, airplanes or anti-tank weapons or whatever. But then it has exactly this problem, which is it could sustain both sides' optimism longer, which leads them down a path where they might potentially misperceive each other, or at least sustain one of them. One thing we know about every contest, whether it's in a tennis court or on a battlefield, is somebody's wrong, right? If you both think you're going to win, it can't be true. So, and what happens at the end of the war, what happened on Armistice Day in 1918, is one side said, you know what, this ain't going to turn out any better than it is right now. And they cut a deal. Right? It wasn't a very good deal. They thought they had a better deal than it turned out, but that's another story. But if you can arrive at that consensus without shooting at each other, you don't need shooting. But one of the risks is as we make the process in war more complex, because we have more moving parts, more different ways to harm each other, it becomes harder and harder to get there before the fighting begins. And that is a source of concern for me. Yeah.
So, barring any new hands, would Faiza or Sam like to revisit their questions?
And also, follow up on that. And a follow up on that point, to briefly say that you're making it more costly. The kind of question I have then is, well, let's say it's a 1v1, right? The alliance thing is to the side. Then you kind of have these states that have built up these huge military capacities, and they've, as you said, taken extremely costly measures. Do they just sit on them? What do they redirect attention? Like, I feel like while the qualitative point is really strong because it pushes war further, I think it also has weak points in that it, I think, offers an opportunity too for other smaller rivalries to increase their engagement. Like, they'll see it as this is a 1v1, but I have something neither party has and I'm upset. Do I get involved? And it's extremely high spending that kind of just sits there. And so that's why I was thinking of the alliance thing. If you outsource and it just becomes a fight of, well, I have the better strategic, either geographically or in capacity, alliance ships, then how do those two, one, how does the scenario of, okay, well, we both have done all this costly measure kind of for naught, how does that pan out, and how do, politicians, tax makers justify that? And then also, how does the alliance factor not, or how could you account for the alliance factor?
So there's a piece of the U.S. military called Stratcom, and their job is to prepare for nuclear war. And they have sort of two positions on this. One is they want to be good at nuclear war so they can stand as a deterrent. But on the other hand, they're happy that they don't fight that kind of war because it would be a terrible war, okay? Their motto is that they deter every day, that the nuclear weapons that they have are being used every day, but they're not being used in anger, in war. They're being used to get things that are valuable to the United States, like getting the other side not to attack us, or potentially, and this is a more debatable point, but I'm just making it in a more generic way, is getting things that the United States cares about. We, in international relations, often say that diplomacy is carried out in the shadow of power, right? So if you build power of some kind, let's talk military because it's just what we're talking about, that military power is arguably effective even if it's not pulling triggers and killing the enemy, because the potential to do that can be used in diplomatic negotiations to get the other side to agree to things that they don't want to agree to, but they accept because they recognize that the alternative is ugly, right? So it's a debatable point, one that society has to decide whether spending roughly $1 trillion a year is a sound investment in terms of what we get back. But if you kind of put those two things together and make your own assessment about how much is not having to be attacked by somebody worth, and how much is getting our way in the world in various disagreements worth, I think that's the crude calculation of the return on that investment. Yeah. Real quick, the drone story, one of the things that worries me about drones is it means that the country with drones doesn't have the same skin in the game. And there's a real risk. I think there's no question the U.S. is using its pilotless vehicles in places and in ways that it is not willing to put forces on the ground. And that means that it's doing more of those kinds of things than it would otherwise. To some degree, that means that the U.S. is less at risk with personnel some places, but it also means we're doing more stuff. And I think, there's a kind of a, part of that is risky. So.
Skin in the game was quite well put. Sam, you got about 59 seconds to say something meaningful.
Okay. I'm gonna try to explain that better this time. So the way I see your theory, like I'm just looking at a case. So Ukrainian drones are trying to hit Russian tanks, so they're trying to exploit that vulnerability. So would a state try to counter the drones, or would it try to build new capabilities to make sure that the drones are no longer effective? That was kind of like the premise of my question.
Yeah. So both of those things. Do you counter the counter, or do you build more of the things that are? Either of them are conceivably possible. What it really depends upon is an assessment of where more bang for the buck, where you get more, right? The Soviet response in the Cold War was just to build a whole lot of tanks with the expectation that most of them were going to get, awkward holes in them. And we don't really know how that bet would have turned out, but we do have the Ukraine war, and what we can say is a heck of a lot of post-Soviet tanks aren't doing what tanks are supposed to do anymore in response to the kinds of weapons. The drones are a new and different story, but they're kind of an elaboration of anti-tank weapons, which were innovated in the 1970s and 80s and were supposed to be the backstop of NATO forces against a Soviet invasion.
Great, thank you very much. Let's give our wonderful speaker a great
Thank you.